In a world where fame and skill rule the stage, Julian Vermeer, a celebrated pianist known for his pride and perfection, visits a small village for a quick performance. Confident in his unmatched talent, he challenges a simple, unknown woman, named Clara, to a piano duel, expecting an effortless victory. But the moment she begins to play, everything changes. Her music is unlike anything Julian has ever heard. Full of raw emotion, honesty, and life, this quiet woman's melody not only surprises the crowd, but awakens something deep inside Julian, forcing him to question his beliefs, his passion, and the true meaning of music. What starts as a challenge becomes a journey of self-discovery, humility, and connection, revealing that sometimes the simplest notes hold the greatest power. Julian Vermeer had never tasted failure. From the time he was a small boy, sitting at a grand piano with his feet barely reaching the pedals, people whispered that he was a prodigy. His fingers moved like silk over the keys, and his memory was razor-sharp. He could hear a piece once and play it back flawlessly. His teachers praised him, his parents pushed him, and by the age of 16, he was already traveling the world, performing in sold-out concert halls and receiving standing ovations wherever he went. People didn't just call him talented, they called him a genius. And Julian believed them, but genius had made him proud. He looked down on others who struggled to play what came naturally to him. To him, music wasn't about feeling. It was about control, precision, and perfection. He never smiled during performances. He played as if proving a point, that no one could ever match him. And honestly, most people couldn't. One rainy afternoon, Julian arrived in a quiet countryside town to perform at a local music festival. It wasn't his usual grand venue, but a friend had recommended it, saying the people were kind and the setting peaceful. Julian agreed, mostly because he liked the idea of being worshipped in a small town where classical music was rare. He stayed at a charming inn and practiced in silence, his long fingers dancing over the piano keys like they always did. His manager arranged a post-recital dinner at the town hall, where Julian would meet some of the guests, music lovers, and perhaps a few local musicians. The performance went exactly as Julian expected. He wore a black suit, sat at the piano with the air of a king, and played Rachmaninoff with such ferocity that even the walls seemed to tremble. The audience clapped politely, then wildly, standing to their feet in applause. Julian gave a small bow, not smiling, not thanking anyone. He was used to the admiration. It was his right. After the show, he arrived at the town hall for dinner. The room was warm with laughter and filled with the scent of homemade food. Locals greeted him shyly, offering praise with wide eyes. An old man in a wool cap thanked him for bringing big city music to their little town. A group of teenagers asked for selfies. Julian answered politely, but with the kind of detachment a celebrity gives fans. He didn't ask their names. He didn't want to. That's when he noticed her. Clara was sitting alone near the window, her hair tied back simply, wearing a cardigan that looked handmade. She was in her 50s, with a calm face and kind eyes. She hadn't applauded loudly, like the others. In fact, she'd clapped only a little with a quiet smile. Julian, for some reason, felt slightly irritated by her calmness. He walked over, a wine glass in hand, and asked, "Did you enjoy the performance?" She looked up, smiled warmly, and said, "Yes, very much. You have excellent technique." "Thank you," Julian replied, slightly confused by her wording. Excellent technique? Most people said extraordinary or brilliant. Something about the way she spoke felt too casual, too neutral. "Do you play?" he asked. "I used to," Clara said with a nod. "A long time ago." Julian raised his eyebrows. "Professionally?" "No," she said. "Just for myself. I never had formal training. I just play what I feel." Julian took a sip of his wine, forcing a smile. That phrase, "play what I feel," irked him. To him, music was a language of rules, discipline, and structure. People who said things like that usually played with sloppy fingers and poor rhythm. Yet here she was, speaking about music like it was a feeling rather than a skill. "That's lovely," he said, a little too politely. "But don't you think feeling needs direction? Discipline? Without that, isn't it just noise?" Clara chuckled softly. "Perhaps. But sometimes, music is like breathing. You don't think about it. You just let it happen." Julian smiled, but there was a sharpness behind it now. The guests around them had started to listen. A few raised their eyebrows, sensing a tension forming. One man leaned in and whispered to his wife, "I think she just challenged him without realizing it." "I see," Julian said, turning slightly toward the others. "Well, maybe we should test this. Would you like to have a little friendly piano duel?" Clara's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Me?" "Yes," Julian said, now enjoying the attention. "Just for fun. You say you play by feeling. I play by training. Let's see how it sounds side by side." A small laugh passed through the room. Clara looked around, slightly embarrassed, but she didn't seem afraid. She glanced at the old upright piano standing in the corner of the hall and nodded gently. "If it's just for fun," she said. Julian clapped his hands. "Wonderful! Tomorrow evening right here. Let's give this town something new to talk about." People cheered, amused and excited. No one expected anything more than entertainment. They believed Julian would dominate her with his complex sonatas and fiery passages. After all, Clara was just a simple woman who hadn't trained. She wasn't famous. She wasn't powerful. She was just Clara. But something about her calmness stayed with Julian that night. While he lay in his hotel bed staring at the ceiling, he thought of her face. Not nervous, not eager to win, just peaceful. It annoyed him. What kind of musician wasn't competitive? Where was her fire? In the morning, Julian practiced intensely. He chose pieces with impossible runs and dynamic shifts, things only someone with years of study could attempt. He wanted the audience to see the clear difference between art and amateur, between talent and genius. He even imagined the look on Clara's face when she realized she was out of her depth. Meanwhile, Clara watered her garden, fed her cat, and made soup for her neighbor who was feeling ill. She didn't practice. Not once. When asked, she smiled and said, "I'll just play what comes to me." To outsiders, it seemed like a joke. But something strange was beginning to build in the town. People started taking sides, not seriously, but with a sense of drama. Children made pretend posters. Local bakers made cookies shaped like pianos. Teenagers joked that it was the musical event of the year. But somewhere deep inside, even the skeptics began to feel that something more was happening, something they couldn't explain. By the evening, the atmosphere was charged. Julian arrived wearing another black suit, looking sharp and sure of himself. Clara came in a soft blue dress, her hair pinned loosely. No makeup, no preparation. Just herself. As Julian walked past the piano, he tapped the keys and muttered, "Ready for war?" Clara smiled. "I don't believe in war, just music." And that one sentence, simple and sincere, carried more weight than Julian expected. It echoed in his mind as he sat down at the piano to perform first. He reminded himself that she didn't stand a chance, that this would be over soon. But deep down, beneath his pride and precision, something had begun to shift. And though he didn't know it yet, the moment she would place her fingers on those keys, everything Julian believed about music, and about himself, would start to unravel. The next morning, the entire town seemed to buzz with quiet excitement. What had started as a light-hearted challenge between a world-famous pianist and a simple local woman was now the talk of the town. Shops were chatting about it. People at the bakery were discussing what Clara might play. Even children who had never touched a piano were pretending to battle like Julian and Clara would. Nobody had expected this small countryside town to suddenly become the stage for something so unusual. Some thought it would just be funny. Others were secretly hoping Clara would surprise everyone. But most people simply couldn't stop thinking about it. Julian, however, was not amused by the attention. To him, this was a serious matter. At first, it had been a joke, something to amuse the guests and remind everyone of his talent. But now, people were treating the duel as if it were real. And worse, they were talking about Clara as if she had a chance. That made Julian feel uncomfortable, even slightly angry. In his mind, this woman had no place standing beside him at a piano. She had no training, no titles, no fame. She said she played by feeling, as if that meant anything in the world of real music. After breakfast, Julian locked himself in the music room at his inn. He didn't even greet the staff politely as he normally did. He was focused. He needed to make sure that the difference between him and Clara was clear to everyone watching. He opened his leather-bound sheet music folder and picked his weapons carefully. He would play Chopin's Ballade No. 1, followed by one of Liszt's most demanding etudes, and then end with his own improvisation that he had been developing for years. Each piece had fast runs, sudden changes in dynamics, and parts that most pianists feared to attempt on stage. He practiced until his fingers hurt. He paid close attention to every note, every pause, every breath in the music. He didn't just want to perform well, he wanted to crush her performance, leave no space for doubt. He imagined the crowd clapping for him, turning away politely when Clara played her slow, simple little tune. He imagined her smiling awkwardly, realizing the mistake she had made by accepting his challenge. Meanwhile, Clara was at home, preparing lunch for a neighbor and listening to birdsong through her open kitchen window. She hadn't touched her piano that day, nor had she the day before. She wasn't worried about the duel. She didn't even think of it as a duel. To her, music had always been a private thing, something she turned to when she was sad, happy, or simply thinking. She didn't play to impress anyone. She played because it helped her feel alive. When a curious neighbor asked her if she was nervous, Clara just smiled and said, "No, I'll just sit down and see what wants to come out of my fingers." Some people found that answer beautiful. Others thought she was being too calm, maybe even foolish. But no one could say she wasn't sincere. Throughout the day, people kept talking about the coming event. The local newspaper printed a small headline: "World Pianist faces off with town's own Clara tonight." A photo of Julian in his suit was placed next to an old picture of Clara from a church recital years ago. It made people laugh, but it also made them curious. No one had heard Clara play in a long time. Some didn't even know she still played. Some townspeople remembered seeing her at the old piano in the church years ago. They recalled how she used to close her eyes while playing, and how some of them had quietly cried during her music, even if the notes weren't perfect. There was something in the way she played that made people feel like she knew their pain, their joy, their secret memories. But could that really stand against a master like Julian? By evening, the town hall had been completely rearranged. The chairs were all set in neat rows facing the stage. A grand piano borrowed from the nearby music academy stood polished and waiting. Lights were dimmed, and soft candles lined the side tables. It was as if something magical was about to happen. Julian arrived early. He wore another tailored black suit and shiny shoes. His face was calm, but his eyes were sharp. He walked slowly through the rows of chairs, glancing at the audience as it filled. He didn't smile much. He was saving all his energy for the piano. Clara arrived just 10 minutes before the event. She wore a plain lavender dress, the same she had worn to a church wedding months ago. Her hair was gently tied back, and she wore a pair of old, comfortable shoes. When she entered, a few people clapped softly, not out of respect for fame, but for kindness. She waved, smiling warmly, and walked slowly toward the front. Julian noticed her entrance and gave a slight nod. "Ready?" he asked, his voice formal. Clara nodded. "As I'll ever be." Before the performance began, the town mayor stepped up to say a few words. He thanked Julian for visiting and praised Clara for her bravery. The audience chuckled, not in a mocking way, but in appreciation of how unique the night had become. Then the mayor said, "Let the music speak." Julian was invited to play first. He took a deep breath, walked to the piano, and sat down like a king on his throne. As soon as his fingers touched the keys, the room transformed. The sounds of Chopin filled the hall, sharp, elegant, and fierce. His hands flew across the keys with speed and force. People watched in silence, some with open mouths, amazed by the power he showed. Every note was exact, every rhythm followed like clockwork. The grand piano seemed to obey him completely, like a loyal soldier following commands. When he finished the first piece, the audience clapped. Then came Liszt, which was even faster and more difficult. Again, Julian didn't miss a single note. He ended with his personal composition, adding in fast scales, daring jumps, and complex chords. When he stood up, the applause was loud. He bowed quickly, not smiling, and returned to his seat, breathing fast. He looked over at Clara. She was watching him with peaceful eyes, not shaken at all. Then it was her turn. Clara stood up slowly, walked to the piano, and took her seat. She didn't open any sheet music. She didn't adjust the bench. She simply placed her hands gently on the keys and closed her eyes. There was a moment of quiet, as if even the candles stopped flickering. And then she began. The first note was soft, not flashy, not loud, just gentle. Then another, and another. A melody began to form like a stream flowing slowly through a forest. It was simple, almost too simple. But there was something in it, something human, something deep. She played as if the music was telling a story, one that had no words, but spoke straight to the heart. People who had been ready to cough or shift in their chairs suddenly froze. Their eyes widened. It didn't matter that the notes weren't fast. It didn't matter that her fingers didn't dance across the keys like Julian's. The music was alive. It held sadness and hope at the same time. It reminded people of memories they didn't know they had. A child holding their grandmother's hand, a man walking alone in the rain, a woman watching the sun rise after a long night. That's what Clara's music sounded like life. Julian sat very still in his chair. At first he watched with distant interest. Then something inside him began to shift. He leaned forward, slightly. His eyes narrowed, not in judgment, but in confusion. Why did this simple music feel so heavy? Why did it make his chest tighten? He looked around and saw people crying quietly, others staring in wonder. And for the first time in years, Julian felt unsure. When Clara finished, there was silence. No, one clapped right away. It was as if they needed time to return to reality. Then slowly the hall erupted in applause, not loud and wild, but warm and full. Some stood, others stayed seated, wiping their eyes. Clara turned toward the audience and gave a small, thankful bow. Then she walked back to her seat, as if nothing unusual had happened. Julian didn't move. His heart was beating fast, not from excitement, but from something he didn't know how to name. For all his training, for all the thousands of hours he had spent perfecting his craft, he had never created what Clara had just done in 10 minutes. Her music had no speed, no drama, no competition, but it had truth. And for Julian Vermeer, that realization was more powerful and more humbling than any applause he had ever received. After the night of the piano duel, something had changed inside Julian Vermeer. It wasn't something people could see from the outside. He still walked tall, wore the same fine suits, and carried the same calm expression on his face. But inside, He was restless. Something he couldn't fully understand had been stirred by Clara's performance. It wasn't just that people had liked her playing. It was the way they had felt it, the way they had connected to it, the way he had connected to it, without meaning to. That feeling hadn't left him since. He had spent his whole life believing that perfect skill was the highest goal in music. That emotion came after structure, not before. That training made a musician, not heart. But Clara had played a simple melody, without any sheet music, without preparation, and it had made people cry. He had performed some of the hardest pieces ever written, and yet, in that room, her notes had said more than all of his did. The next morning he woke up early. The sun was just beginning to rise, and the small town was quiet. He stood by the window of his inn room looking out at the trees and rooftops. His mind kept going back to that moment Clara began to play. He had expected something average, something boring. But instead, her music had made him feel like a boy again. Unsure, small, and suddenly aware that he didn't know everything. It was an uncomfortable feeling, but it was also a strangely beautiful one. Julian went downstairs for breakfast, and the innkeeper greeted him with a warm smile. "Still thinking about last night?" she asked. He nodded. She was something, wasn't she? He didn't answer right away. Yes, she was. People around town were still talking about the duel, but they weren't treating it like a competition anymore. They weren't saying who won or lost. Instead, they talked about how magical the night had been. Some said it was the most emotional music they'd ever heard. Others said it reminded them of people they had lost, or dreams they had forgotten. Everyone had felt something, and that was because of Clara. Julian walked through the town later that day. A few people smiled and waved. A child asked for his autograph, and he gave it. But his mind was elsewhere. He found himself walking toward Clara's house without planning to. He didn't even know what he would say. Part of him still held on to pride. The other part wanted to understand her. Her small house was surrounded by a garden. Flowers of different colors bloomed in simple clay pots. A cat slept lazily on the front step. Julian stood there for a moment before knocking. After a few seconds, Clara opened the door. She looked surprised to see him, but not unhappy. "Julian," she said, smiling. "What brings you here?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "Can we talk?" "Of course," she said, stepping aside to let him in. Her house was cozy, filled with books, old photographs, and the scent of fresh herbs. A small upright piano stood by the window, its wood slightly worn from years of use. He noticed it didn't even have a cover on the keys. They sat down at her kitchen table where she poured them both a cup of tea. For a while, there was silence. Then Julian said, "You play differently from anyone I've ever met." Clara nodded, not as a compliment, just a fact. "I suppose I do." "Why don't you perform? You could be famous." "I was never interested in fame," she said. "And I don't like being on stage. Music isn't something I do to show others who I am. It's something I do to remember who I am." Julian stared at her, confused but fascinated. "But how do you know what to play? You didn't even use sheet music." She smiled softly. "I listen." "Listen to what?" "To what I'm feeling. To what life is saying. Sometimes I just sit at the piano and let my fingers find the path. It's like walking in the dark with your hands stretched out. You trust the space around you." Julian was silent for a moment. He had never played without a plan. He had never sat at the piano without knowing exactly what to do. The idea both frightened and excited him. "I don't know how to do that," he admitted. "You could learn," she said gently. Julian looked down at his cup. "I've spent years learning everything. I know every rule, every style. But when you played last night, I felt something I've never felt before, and I don't understand it." "Maybe it's time to stop trying to understand," Clara said, "and just feel." That sentence stayed with Julian the rest of the day. He went back to the inn but couldn't rest. He kept seeing Clara's hands on the keys, her eyes closed, her face peaceful. That night, when the town was quiet and the stars were out, Julian walked to the town hall alone. The doors were locked, but the caretaker knew him and let him in. The grand piano from the Duel was still on the stage. Julian sat down at the bench. He didn't open any music books. He didn't think about the scales or the finger placements. He just sat there, unsure of what to do. He placed his hands on the keys and paused. Then he pressed a single note. It echoed softly in the empty room. He pressed another, then a third. Slowly, a melody began to form. Not from his mind, but from somewhere deeper. It was clumsy at first, hesitant, but he kept going. He didn't care if the notes were perfect. He was searching for something else, for a truth he had never looked for before. He played for nearly an hour. When he finally stopped, he sat in silence, his heart strangely full. He didn't know what he had just played. He didn't even care. For the first time, he had played not to impress, but to express. The next morning, he went back to Clara's house. "I want to learn," he said. Clara raised an eyebrow. "Learn what?" "How to play the way you do." She smiled, understanding what he meant. "Then you'll have to forget everything you know for a while. I'm ready." And so Julian began something he never expected, a new kind of journey. Each day he would visit Clara. They would sit at her piano, and she would ask him to play how he was feeling, not what he was trained to play. It was hard, frustrating. Often he felt foolish. But slowly something began to change. He learned to listen, to silence, to the wind, to the rhythm of his own breath. He learned to let go of control. One afternoon, Clara asked him to play what sadness sounded like. Julian hesitated, then began. The notes were soft and broken, like the sound of footsteps leaving. Another time, she asked him to play the feeling of hope, and his fingers found a light melody that rose like the morning sun. It was no longer about playing fast or complicated pieces. It was about honesty. Julian stayed in the town for weeks. He canceled concerts. His manager was confused and annoyed. But Julian didn't care. He was discovering a new side of music, and of himself. And Clara? She was happy to help him. But she never told him what to play. She only guided him back to himself. One evening they played together, side by side on the piano bench. They didn't speak. They didn't decide anything in advance. They just played, letting the notes speak to each other like an old conversation between friends. When they finished, they both smiled. Julian looked at her and said, "Thank you." Clara nodded. "Now you understand." And he did. For the first time in his life, Julian Vermeer wasn't just a pianist, he was a musician, and that made all the difference. Julian had never planned to stay in the small town for more than a few days. It was supposed to be a short visit, perform, enjoy the quiet countryside, then move on to the next grand city and the next shining stage. But ever since the piano, Duel with Clara, everything had changed. What started as a clash of pride had turned into something deeper, something that touched parts of Julian he didn't even know existed. And now, weeks had passed, and he was still there, still waking, up to the peaceful sounds of birds and wind instead of busy traffic and the rush of fans. Something about the town, and more than that, something about Clara, was holding him gently, like a song you didn't want to end. Each day was simple, yet full. Julian would walk through the town in the morning, nodding at people who now saw him not as a star, but as someone they had shared a special night with. The townspeople no longer spoke to him with formality. They treated him like a neighbor. Some offered him baked goods, others invited him to small gatherings. It was new to him, this kind of honest, open warmth. He had spent years surrounded by applause and praise, but this was different. This was real. Clara had become his teacher, though she never called herself that. She never gave him strict lessons. She didn't test him or make him repeat things. Instead, she offered him quiet, space, and simple questions. Sometimes she would ask, "What does the wind sound like today?" Or, "If your heart were a song, what key would it be in?" These weren't things he had ever been asked before. At first, he thought they were silly, but over time, he understood. She wasn't asking him to think like a student. She was asking him to feel like a human. They played together often, not for practice, but for joy. Their music didn't follow rules, it followed moods. One morning they played a piece that sounded like rain falling on a tin roof. Another time, their melody rose and fell like waves crashing on the shore. Sometimes they would laugh in the middle of playing, surprised by the sounds they created. Other times they would sit in silence after finishing, both moved by something neither could explain. Julian began keeping a notebook, but not one filled with music notes. Instead, he wrote down thoughts, feelings, dreams, and moments that touched him. One page read, "The way Clara pauses before the first note, like listening to the world." Another said, "I used to play to impress. Now I play to express." The people in town noticed the change. He was still Julian Vermeer, the famous pianist, but something was softer about him now. His eyes seemed more open. His voice had more patience. Even the way he sat at the piano had changed. He no longer carried the weight of perfection on his shoulders. Instead, he played like someone who had finally discovered why music mattered. One afternoon, Clara invited Julian to visit the old church where she used to play as a girl. The building was small and quiet, its walls holding years of whispers and prayers. The piano there was old and slightly out of tune, but it had charm, like a voice with a story to tell. Julian ran his fingers over the keys and smiled. "It's not perfect," he said. "Neither are we," Clara replied, smiling back. He played a soft tune, letting the piano speak in its own worn-out voice. Clara joined in, adding delicate notes, like wildflowers growing between cracks. The echo in the church made every sound feel bigger, yet more sacred. A few townspeople wandered in, sat quietly on the benches, and closed their eyes. No one clapped at the end. There was no need. The silence afterward was its own applause. That night Julian couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the people in the church, the sound of their breathing during the music, the quiet tears on one woman's face. He had played in the grandest halls in the world, with thousands watching, but this felt deeper, more honest, more needed. He began to wonder if maybe his whole career had been built on something hollow, not wrong, but missing something. All the awards, the interviews, the sold-out shows, yes, they mattered. But not in the same way this small moment in a village church mattered. Not in the way Clara's music reached into people's hearts without needing fame or praise. A few days later, Julian received a call from his manager. "You've been off the schedule for too long," the voice on the phone said. "People are waiting. What should I tell the Vienna organizers?" Julian looked out the window at the golden afternoon light falling across Clara's garden. The cat was curled up in a flower pot. Somewhere nearby, someone was playing a harmonica. "Tell them I need more time," he said. "Time for what?" "To learn how to play again." He ended the call before hearing the response. Julian started walking around the town every evening, sometimes alone, sometimes with Clara. They talked about life, not music, about books, lost loves, family, and childhood dreams. Julian spoke of his strict piano teacher in Berlin, who had once scolded him for crying during a performance. Clara told him how she learned to play by listening to the wind and the birds. "I always thought music was already in the world," she said. "The piano just lets us hear it." One evening, as they sat by the riverbank watching fireflies flicker across the water, Julian turned to her. "Do you ever wish you had gone out into the world? Played for thousands?" Clara thought for a while. Sometimes, but I think I would have lost the reason I play. Julian nodded. He understood now. He was beginning to feel the same. He began composing pieces inspired by the town. One was about the old baker who gave him fresh rolls every morning. Another was about a little girl who twirled in the street with her arms out like a bird. One was simply called Clara. Each melody was simple but full of heart. He wrote them down, not to publish, but to remember. Word slowly began to spread beyond the town. A few journalists heard rumors that Julian Vermeer had disappeared into a countryside village. Some thought it was a retreat, others a breakdown. One music magazine even published a headline, "The Maestro and the Mystery Pianist." But Julian didn't care what they said. For the first time, he was not living for headlines. One day, Clara received a letter. It was an invitation to perform at a local music festival in the next town. The organizers had heard of her playing during the Duel and wanted her to perform. She was surprised and unsure. "I don't do stages," she said, handing the letter to Julian. "You don't have to," he replied gently. "But maybe," she said after a long pause, "maybe I want to." Julian offered to accompany her. "We can play together." Clara agreed. The festival day arrived, and they drove to the town in Julian's rental car. The stage was small, the audience modest, but the lights, the sound of the microphone, and the rows of seats all felt new and strange to Clara. She looked nervous. Julian squeezed her hand. "Just play like it's your living room." They sat side by side. The first few notes were shaky, uncertain. But then something shifted. Clara closed her eyes. Julian followed her lead. Their fingers moved together, not like performers, but like friends telling a story. The music flowed. It was quiet in some places, wild in others. At times, their notes danced playfully. At other times, they whispered secrets. The audience watched, fully drawn in. No one moved. When the last note faded, there was a long pause. Then applause. Deep, real applause. Not for fame, not for skill, but for truth. Clara smiled. Her eyes sparkled. Later that night, as they returned to their town, Julian said, "You were brilliant." Clara laughed. "I forgot there were people watching." "That's the magic," Julian said. And as they drove under the starlit sky, neither of them spoke much. There was no need. Music had already said everything that needed to be said. Back in the town, life went on as usual. But for Julian and Clara, something had changed again. They were no longer just teacher and student, or opposites who had once competed. They were now partners in something deeper. A journey of music, yes, but also of discovery, of healing, of remembering who they were beneath all the noise of the world. Julian began helping the local school teach music. He donated a piano. He gave lessons to children, not in the strict, formal way he had learned, but in Clara's way. He asked them how they felt, what colors they saw in their minds, what story they wanted to tell with their hands. The children loved him. He became Mr. Julian, the piano man who once played in New York but now drank tea in the village and taught songs about clouds. As weeks turned into months, Julian found himself writing again. But this time, it wasn't for his agent or for international stages. He was writing an album, a collection of the simple, heartfelt melodies that had come to him during his time in the town. He planned to call it The Quiet Piano, and the first track was called Clara's Tune. Clara didn't say much about it, but when she heard him play it one evening, she wiped away a tear and whispered, "That's me." Julian smiled. "It's you, as you showed me how to hear." And just like that, two people from completely different worlds had found something rare, something not written in notes or fame or applause. They had found music that healed, music that spoke when words couldn't, music that connected hearts and In the quiet of their little town, with the piano between them and the stars above, their story continued. Julian never imagined his life would turn out this way. There had been a time when his days were planned down to the minute. Rehearsals, interviews, concerts, flights. Every moment of his schedule had been filled, every week booked months in advance. He had thought that was success, that it was the only way to live if he wanted to be remembered as one of the greats. But now his mornings began with birdsong, not alarms. His afternoons were filled with music that flowed without pressure. And his evenings? Sometimes they were spent playing piano duets with Clara. Other times they simply sat together in silence, sipping tea, watching the sun disappear behind the hills. His heart had changed. What started as a piano duel between an arrogant maestro and a quiet village woman had become something much bigger than either of them expected. It had become a journey, a path to rediscover what music truly meant. And even more than that, it had become a journey of understanding, of connection, of humility, and of quiet joy. Julian had now been in the town for over 6 months. His manager had stopped calling. The international press had lost interest. The world had moved on. But Julian hadn't. He had stayed, not because he had nowhere else to go, but because he had finally found somewhere that felt like home. The townspeople treated him like one of their own now. They no longer stared when he walked by or whispered about him in cafes. They invited him to community dinners. They asked him to play at weddings, birthdays, and school events. He said yes to all of it. Not because he wanted applause, but because he wanted to give something back. One day he was walking through the town square when he noticed a poster on a wall. It was for a national piano competition, one of the biggest in the country, the kind of event he would have once judged. But this time, something was different. The competition had added a new category: emotional expression in music. And, right below the title, it read, "Inspired by the story of Clara, the pianist who changed everything." Julian stopped and stared at the poster for a long time. His heart swelled with quiet pride. Clara had never tried to become famous. She had never asked for the spotlight. But her music had found its way into the hearts of people far beyond the village. He took the poster and brought it to her house. When she saw it, she smiled gently and said, "I don't need that kind of recognition. But it's sweet." Julian sat across from her. "You may not need it, but others do. People need to know that music can be more than notes on a page, that it can be alive." She looked at him and said softly, "Then let's teach them." That night, they sat at her piano and began writing something together. Not a single piece, but an entire collection. A project that would bring together everything they had discovered: emotion, simplicity, truth. They called it The Soul of the Keys. It wasn't just a music album, it was a movement. They invited young pianists from across the region to come to their small town and learn in Clara's style. Julian used his name to spread the word, but he made it clear. This wasn't about technique. It wasn't about speed or fame. It was about feeling. The first to arrive was a shy girl named Anya. She had been rejected from 3 music schools for being too soft. Clara listened to her play and said, "You play like you're telling a secret. That's beautiful." Anya cried. No one had ever told her that before. Next came a boy named Rafi, who only knew how to play by ear. He couldn't read music. Julian, once a strict follower of written compositions, now sat with Rafi and said, "Let your fingers follow your heart." Rafi played a tune so full of joy that even the birds outside seemed to join in. More students came, each with their own style, their own fears, their own hidden music. Julian and Clara worked with them all, gently guiding, encouraging, never judging. The house became filled with laughter, mistakes, breakthroughs, and the sound of piano keys being discovered like never before. Clara's garden once a quiet space, for her and her cat, now became a place of community. Children ran through it. Teenagers practiced there. Julian even built a small outdoor stage so they could have open-air concerts. People came from neighboring towns just to listen. They didn't come expecting perfection. They came for connection. News began to spread again, but this time it was different. It wasn't gossip or scandal. It was wonder. Headlines appeared in newspapers. The village that taught the world to feel music. And Julian Vermeer's quiet revolution. Reporters showed up, but Julian refused television. Interviews. He told them, "You want to understand what's happening here? Sit in the back of a lesson. Listen. Don't ask questions. Just feel." One day, an old friend of Julian's visited from the city. He was a conductor who had once worked with Julian in London. The man looked around the village and said, "I never imagined you'd end up here." Julian smiled. "Neither did I." "And you're not coming back?" Julian looked at the children playing in the garden, at Clara arranging wildflowers in a vase, at the sunlight dancing on the piano keys through the window. "I already did come back," he said. "I just didn't know where home was until now." But, even in this peaceful world, a question slowly began to rise. What next? Julian and Clara had built something special, but they both knew it couldn't stay hidden forever. Not because they wanted fame, but because the message behind their music needed to reach more people. One evening, Julian stood at the edge of the field, looking at the stars. Clara came and stood beside him. "Do you think it's time?" asked. She knew what he meant. "Yes, but only if we do it our way." And so they began planning something bold. Not a concert, not a competition. A tour, but not like any tour before. They would visit small towns, forgotten schools, quiet corners of the country. They would bring music where no one usually brought it. Not to big halls, but to farms, to parks, to orphanages, to villages where people had never seen a piano up close. They called it the listening journey. They packed an old van with a portable keyboard, folding chairs, and a small sound system. Julian drove. Clara made the tea and packed the lunches. Some of their students joined them. They went from place to place, not advertising, not selling tickets, just showing up and playing. In one town, they played in a barn. The cows seemed to enjoy it. In another, they set up near a river, and fishermen sat down with their lunches to listen. In a school for deaf children, they brought special speakers that let the children feel the vibrations of the music. One child cried not because she could hear, but because she could sense the emotion. At every stop, people asked them, "Why are you doing this?" Julian would answer, "Because everyone deserves to feel the music, not just hear it." They recorded the journey in a small journal. Clara wrote down stories of the people they met. Julian drew little sketches of each place. Together they were not just creating music. They were collecting moments, proof that even the softest song could reach the deepest parts of the human soul. Months passed. They returned home at last, tired but full. The house welcomed them like an old friend. The garden was a little wild. The piano was waiting. Julian sat down and began to play. Clara joined him. Their fingers found each other as if the music had been waiting too. That evening, under the stars, they held a final gathering. Everyone from the town came. Their students, the children, the baker, the school teacher, the woman who ran the flower shop. They sat in the garden as Julian and Clara played the final piece of the listening journey. It had no title, no written notes. It was just music, pure, honest, full of everything they had lived through together. When it ended, there was silence. Then someone whispered, "Thank you," and that was all that needed to be said. Julian looked at Clara. "I used to think I needed to be the best. And now?" she asked. "Now I just want to be true." She smiled. And in that moment, Julian Vermeer, the world-famous pianist who once believed that perfection was everything, finally understood that the most perfect music wasn't the one that amazed people. It was the one that reached them, that stayed with them, that healed them. And somewhere deep in his heart, he knew he had not only found the greatest music of his life, he had found himself.